The wind coming off Lake Michigan wasn't just cold, it was a physical entity, a scalpel of damp ice that sliced through layers of clothing and settled deep in the marrow of the bones. It howled through the concrete canyons of Chicago's industrial district, whipping discarded newspapers into frantic dances and carrying the sour smells of diesel, rust, and decay. Huddled in the recessed doorway of a shuttered machine parts warehouse, David Reid tried and failed to shield the flickering flame of his lighter. At 52, his body was a map of his downfall, each tremor in his hands, each ache in his joints, a landmark of loss. The last cigarette in a crumpled pack of Mavericks finally caught. He took a long, desperate drag, the cheap tobacco doing nothing to warm the permanent chill that had taken root inside him. He had become part of the urban scenery, another piece of street furniture to be navigated around. The well-dressed professionals who scurried past, their breath pluming in the frigid air, performed the same unconscious dance. A brief glance, a flicker of discomfort, a swift adjustment of their path. He was an inconvenient truth, a ghost they trained themselves not to see. From an inside pocket, he retrieved his wallet. The leather was cracked and warped, molded by time and neglect into the shape of his hip. Inside, protected by a smudged plastic sleeve, was a single photograph. A little girl, no more than 7, with a wild mane of blonde hair escaping from under a pink knitted hat, Lily. Her grin was lopsided, a front tooth missing, and her eyes sparkled with a joy so pure it was like a physical blow. The world doesn't fire a gun to put you in your place. It just turns the temperature down, 1 degree at a time, until you wake up one day and realize you've frozen solid. And the funny thing is, the cold starts to feel like home. It's what you deserve. It's your destiny. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the present. For a single, blissful moment, the city's cacophony, the blaring horns, the shriek of the L train, the distant sirens, faded away. In its place came a memory, so vivid it was hallucinatory, the sound of unrestrained childish laughter echoing through the high ceilings of a home he could barely picture anymore. The thunder of small running feet on polished hardwood. "Daddy, look what I made!" The memory was a physical ache, a phantom limb of the heart. His eyes snapped open. The laughter was gone, replaced by the guttural roar of a passing truck. The pain, however, remained, a heavy, permanent stone lodged behind his ribs. When the cigarette was nothing but a filter, he pushed himself upright, his joints protesting with a symphony of pops and creaks. He moved with the slow, weary gait of a man whose destination was merely a different version of where he started. His journey ended at a hidden niche under the grimy shadow of the Kinzie Street Bridge, a cramped space shielded from the worst of the wind by stacks of discarded pallets and swollen black trash bags. The constant thunder of traffic overhead was the relentless soundtrack to this chapter of his life. He knelt on the frozen ground, his knees cracking like dry twigs. With the practiced, reverent care of a priest at an altar, he pried a loose brick from the base of the viaduct. In the shallow cavity behind it, he carefully placed his wallet. It was all he had left of any value, and he hid it not just from potential thieves, but from the crushing reality it represented. His identity, his failure, his sentence. He settled onto his bed, a thin slab of foam insulation layered with a threadbare, musty blanket that smelled of mold and despair. He curled into a tight fetal ball, a human comma trying to make itself as small as possible, conserving what little body heat he had. In the distance, the rising and falling wail of an ambulance siren intertwined with the moaning wind, a perfect duet of urgency and absolute isolation. This was rock bottom. He had stopped trying to climb out years ago. The fall had been too long. The impact had shattered something fundamental. As exhaustion finally pulled him into a fitful, shivering sleep, the camera drew back in a slow, ascending shot. From above, his solitary figure appeared minuscule and insignificant, a dark speck against the vast grey sprawl of the sleeping city. And then, At the far end of the dimly lit street, a sleek, black Audi A8 glided to a silent stop. Its engine was a whisper. Its headlights died. The driver's window lowered just a crack, a dark slit that revealed nothing of the occupant within. Someone was watching, someone from a world David Reid believed was lost to him forever. The morning light in Chicago was a pale, anemic thing that did little to warm the industrial backstreet. David was jolted from his restless half-sleep, not by the sun, but by the grating screech of metal on concrete and the familiar cadence of two bickering voices cutting through the dawn chill. "Would you hurry it up, Brian? Carl needs these pots back by 7, and you're playing treasure hunter," said a woman's voice, sharp with a practicality born from long hours and low pay. "Relax, Jess. I'm scouting. You never know what these places toss out." "It's like a high-stakes thrift store back here," a younger man's voice replied, buzzing with a nervous energy that seemed out of place in the grim surroundings. David shifted, his body a chorus of aches and protests. He saw them, a man and a woman in their late 20s, both wearing the kind of worn, practical clothes that spoke of manual labor. The woman, Jessica, stood with her arms crossed, her breath pluming in the cold air, while the man, Brian, poked through a pile of discarded machinery and electronics with a piece of rebar. Brian's poking stopped as he noticed David moving. A familiar, condescending smirk twisted his lips. "Well, look who's decided to join the land of the living. Morning, Your Highness. You mind shifting your palace? We're on official soup kitchen business here. This is a prime foraging spot." David said nothing. He never did. Words were a currency he had run out of long ago. He simply pushed himself up, his movements slow and deliberate, and took a few steps back, melting into the deeper shadows of the alleyway, becoming a silhouette against the dirty brick wall. "Just grab the pots and let's go, Brian. Stop messing around," Jessica said, her eyes flicking toward David. There was no particular kindness in her gaze, but no active cruelty either. It was the look one might give a piece of forgotten furniture, a brief acknowledgement of its existence before moving on with the day's more pressing business. As they began heaving large, industrial-sized stock pots onto a heavy metal cart, David's gaze drifted over the small pile of junk Brian had been investigating. A vintage transistor radio with a cracked casing, a small desk fan with several bent blades, the disemboweled shell of a microwave. His eyes, usually clouded and distant, sharpened for a fraction of a second. His fingers, stuffed deep in the pockets of his worn coat, twitched with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. It was a subtle spasm, the muscle memory of tracing a circuit board, of tightening an invisible screw, a ghost of the craftsman he used to be. Later, the scene shifted to the basement of a soot-stained red brick church. A hand-painted sign by the door read, "River North Community Kitchen," and the air inside was a thick, warm blanket of overlapping scents. Simmering chicken broth, the sharp tang of industrial bleach, and the underlying sweet and sour smell of unwashed bodies and weary resignation. It was a port in a storm for the shipwrecked, a place where hope was served alongside a meager meal. A line of people, a mosaic of hard luck, broken dreams, and quiet endurance, waited patiently with empty bowls and downcast eyes. David stood at the very end of the line, his head bowed, his presence a mere whisper in the crowded room, trying to take up as little space as possible. In the open-plan kitchen, separated by a long counter, a large bear-like man named Carl was locked in a losing battle with a colossal ancient industrial stove. One of the massive burners was completely dead, a dark circle of cold iron. He smacked the control knob with the heel of his hand, a gesture of pure, ingrained frustration. "Come on, you cantankerous piece of junk," he grumbled under his breath, his voice a low growl that rumbled from his chest. "Not today. I just need you to work today. I've got 50 people to feed." David received his portion of thin, watery soup without a word and found his usual spot at a far table, his back to the wall facing the door. It was an old habit, the need to see everything coming. But as he mechanically spooned the bland broth into his mouth, his eyes kept drifting back to the stove. They weren't seeing a dirty old appliance. They were reading a schematic. His gaze tracked the path of the gas line, noted the age and wear on the electrical wiring at the back, studied the mechanical configuration of the knobs. He saw the problem as clearly as if a diagnostic manual were overlaid on the machine. A faulty safety valve, a worn wire grounding out against the frame. He knew the fix. The knowledge was just there, dormant but intact, a phantom limb of his engineering mind. He kept eating, the food tasting like ash. His focus was entirely inward, on the ghost of a skill, on the memory of being useful, of being the one who could command machines. His right hand rested on the sticky Formica table, and the fingers of his left, hidden in his lap, moved with a subtle, unconscious grace. They mimed the act of turning a screwdriver, of stripping a wire, of making something broken whole again. The world had taken his family, his home, his name, and his fortune, but it hadn't managed to completely erase the language of mechanics from his hands. It was a whisper of who he was, a spark waiting in the shadows. The community kitchen hummed with the low murmur of a dozen quiet conversations and the clatter of spoons on bowls. It was a familiar, almost soothing rhythm. Then a different sound cut through the din, sharp, piercing, and utterly heart-wrenching. It was the sound of a child's dreams shattering. Mia, the 9-year-old daughter of Sarah, one of the regular volunteers, stood sobbing as if her world had ended. Clutched in her small, trembling hands was a small, pink plastic radio, now silent and useless. "It won't play. It just won't," she wailed, her voice cracking with a grief that seemed too immense for the tiny object. "It's broken!" Her mother knelt, trying to pull her into a hug, her own face etched with helplessness. "Shh, baby. It's okay. We'll get you another one." The promise sounded hollow, even to her. They both knew there was no money for another one. "I don't want another one," Mia cried, her words muffled against her mother's coat. "This one plays Nana's song, the one she used to sing to me. It's the only one that knows it." Brian, walking past with a tub of dirty dishes, paused. He took the radio from Mia's unresisting hands. He shook it next to his ear, hearing nothing but the rattle of its own brokenness. "Yeah, it's toast. Totally fried. Just toss it." He went to hand it back, his gesture dismissive, but Mia recoiled as if he were offering her a poisoned apple. It was then that a voice, rough and unused, like a rusted hinge being forced open, cut through the emotional static of the room. "It's the capacitor. Just a blown capacitor." Every head in the vicinity turned. All eyes landed on David, still sitting in his corner. The ghost had spoken. The zombie had found a voice. Brian snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound that broke the stunned silence. "Oh, you're an electronics expert now, old man. What do you know? Hearing voices in your head telling you that?" David ignored him completely. The mockery was just background noise, a static he'd learned to tune out years ago. His focus was entirely on Mia, on the raw, honest pain in her face that mirrored a pain he knew all too well. He stood, his movements slower than Brian's, but with a strange, deliberate grace. He approached Mia, and with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man of his rough, weathered appearance, he knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Can I see it?" he asked Mia, his voice a low rumble, but softer now, meant only for her. Mia, her cheeks streaked with tears, looked from her mother's worried face to the strange, quiet man. Something in his eyes, a deep, settled sadness that somehow understood her own, made her trust him. She nodded, a tiny, hesitant motion, and handed him the radio as if entrusting him with a wounded bird. From the depths of his tattered coat, he produced his most prized possessions, an old, scratched multi-tool knife and a pair of needle-nose pliers with worn grips. He didn't rush. His movements were deliberate, reverent even. He didn't see a piece of cheap, mass-produced plastic. He saw a vessel for a little girl's most precious memory. In less than a minute, he had the plastic casing pried open, exposing the simple green circuit board inside. His eyes, which usually looked through the world, now looked intently at it, scanning, diagnosing. He found the culprit immediately, a small, bulging capacitor, visibly fried. Without a replacement part, he did the only thing he could. Using the tip of his pliers with the precision of a surgeon, he expertly bridged two contact points on the board, bypassing the failed component. There was a sharp crackle of static from the tiny speaker, then faint and distorted, but unmistakable. The tinny melody of an old jazz standard, Nana's Song, began to play. The silence that fell over the kitchen was absolute, broken only by the fragile tinny music weaving its way through the room. Mia's crying stopped instantly. Her tears ceased, and her eyes widened, shining with a new kind of tears, those of pure, unadulterated wonder. She looked from the singing radio to David, as if he had just reached into the air and pulled a miracle out of it. Brian stood frozen, the tub of dishes forgotten in his hands, his mouth slightly agape. The mockery had been wiped clean from his face, replaced by a blank slate of utter shock. Jessica, who had been watching from near the stove while wiping a counter, didn't look curious anymore. She looked stunned. Her cloth had stilled, and she stared at David, really seeing him for the first time. The grime, the worn clothes, the hollow cheeks. It was all still there, but now it was a disguise, and she had just seen a breathtaking glimpse of what was hiding beneath. Who was this man? As Mia reached out with trembling hands to take her now-living radio back, her mother, Sarah, looked at David, her expression a complex mix of gratitude, awe, and a dawning, unsettling question. Her eyes then dropped to the floor, where David's worn wallet had fallen from his pocket during his work. It had fallen open, and there, staring up from the stained leather, was the photograph of Lily. The miracle of the radio didn't just fix a toy, it fundamentally altered the chemistry of the community kitchen. The air itself felt different, lighter, charged with a new kind of possibility. David was no longer part of the scenery. He was a focal point. Carl observed everything from his domain by the now perfectly functioning stove. For 3 days, he watched. He saw the way David's hands, which usually hung limp at his sides or trembled around a coffee cup, became instruments of precise, confident action the moment they held a tool. He saw the quiet reverence with which people now approached the man in the corner, their skepticism replaced by a hesitant, burgeoning hope. On the 4th morning, Carl dragged a heavy, scarred workbench from a storage closet, its legs screeching in protest against the linoleum floor. He positioned it against a wall, bathed in the weak light from a high, grimy window. The bench was old, its surface a topographical map of stains, burns, and deep gouges, but its oak frame was solid and true. Next, he brought out a metal toolbox, its red paint faded to a rusty pink, its handle worn smooth by unknown hands. He set it on the bench with a definitive clang that echoed in the pre-dawn quiet. He didn't make a speech or ask for permission. He simply caught David's eye from across the room and gave a single firm nod, a gesture between two men who understood practical things. David stared at the bench for a long time, his morning coffee cooling in its chipped mug. It wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was territory. A claim staked in his name, an invitation to exist again in a defined space, to leave the transient shadows of the wall for the permanence of a workstation. He walked over slowly, as if approaching a wild animal or an altar. His fingers, tentative at first, traced a long, deep gouge in the wood, a scar that mirrored the ones he carried internally. The gesture was oddly intimate. The first item to appear on the bench was the broken coffee maker from Brian. It sat there for an hour, a silent test, before David finally clicked open the rusty toolbox. The act of selecting a screwdriver, weighing it in his hand, feeling its balanced heft, felt momentous. As he began methodically disassembling the plastic shell, a visible transformation came over him. His shoulders, perpetually hunched against the world, straightened slightly. His breathing deepened and slowed. He was no longer a man hiding in a corner. He was a craftsman at his station, his entire being focused on the puzzle in front of him. The coffee maker was a simple fix, a clogged valve, a calcium deposit easily scraped away with a pin. But when he returned it to Brian, steaming and gurgling perfectly, it created a ripple effect that transcended the machine itself. An old Ukrainian man named Pavel brought in a heavy, vintage shortwave radio. Its wooden casing split at the seam. "My father listened to this, before the war, to news from home," he said, his voice thick with a memory that spanned oceans and decades. David spent the entire afternoon ignoring the soup line, carefully clamping and gluing the wood, then painstakingly cleaning the dusty internal components with a small brush and isopropyl alcohol he'd specifically asked Carl to find. When the distinct, warm crackle of a distant, German-speaking voice finally emerged from the speaker, Pavel's eyes welled with tears. He clasped David's grease-stained hand in both of his, saying nothing, but communicating a universe of gratitude. A young, tired-looking mother brought in a tiny porcelain music box, its mechanism silent. "It plays her lullaby, the one my mother sang to me," she whispered, as if it were a sacred secret. David, with Mia watching his every move like a hawk, discovered a tiny coiled spring that had slipped from its housing. He didn't just fix it. Under the warm glow of the bench lamp, he showed Mia how the entire mechanism worked, how the pins on the rotating drum plucked the tuned metal teeth to create the song. The girl's eyes were sources of fascination, a different kind of magic replacing the one she'd previously assigned to him. The bench became a place of quiet pilgrimage. It wasn't just about the repairs, it was about the restoration of dignity, of memory, of small, essential joys. David spoke little, but his hands did the talking. They told a story of competence, of patience, of a deep, unspoken understanding that broken things, be they radios, music boxes, or people, deserved a second chance. He was building more than just a repair shop. He was building a reputation. The word spread through the neighborhood like a gentle wave. If you need something fixed, take it to the quiet man at the kitchen. He can heal anything. One evening, as David was meticulously wiping down the bench, storing his tools with a newfound care, Carl approached, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "People are asking," he said, his voice low. "Not just to fix things, they want to learn. Brian's been pestering me about it for 2 days." David looked down at his hands, now permanently stained with grease and solder, and for the first time in a decade, they didn't feel like the hands of a failure. They felt like his own. They felt useful. The rhythm of the kitchen changed. The clatter of pots and the murmur of conversation now shared space with the new sounds from David's workbench, the soft whir of a drill, the hiss of a soldering iron, the precise click of tools finding their place. The bench was no longer just a spot for repairs. It had become a classroom. Brian, his earlier sarcasm replaced by a hungry curiosity, was David's most constant pupil, along with 2 other young men from the neighborhood. David was showing Brian how to rewire a lamp when the kitchen's back door burst open. Sarah stood there, her face a mask of pure panic. In her arms, Mia wheezed, each breath a thin, desperate whistle. Her small chest heaved, her lips taking on a faint bluish tint. "Her inhaler," Sarah gasped, holding up the small plastic medical device. "It's dead. The battery, it won't charge. I called an ambulance, but with the storm, they said it could be an hour." The comfortable sounds of the kitchen ceased. All eyes turned from Mia, struggling to breathe, to the dead device in Sarah's trembling hand, and then to David. The stakes had just escalated from fixing memories to saving a life. Carl's voice was tight. "David." David didn't speak. He moved. He took the inhaler from Sarah, his movements swift but unnervingly calm. His engineer's mind, which could visualize the inner workings of a stove from across a room, now focused entirely on the life-saving gadget. It was more complex than anything he'd tackled here. a miniaturized air compressor, a circuit board, a rechargeable battery. "Need light," he said, his voice low and steady. Brian scrambled to position the bench lamp. David's toolkit was suddenly inadequate. He needed finer tools. He rummaged in a donated electronics bin, finding a discarded smartphone repair kit. With a precision that seemed to slow time itself, he used a spudger to pry open the sealed plastic casing, exposing the intricate interior. "The charging port is fine," he murmured, more to himself than anyone. "It's the battery connection, a solder joint fractured. It's not making contact." The problem was terrifyingly small, a hairline crack invisible to the untrained eye. A collective breath was held. Sarah sobbed quietly, clutching a struggling Mia. David's hands were a study in absolute control. He cleaned the tiny contact point with a drop of solvent. He heated his miniature soldering iron, the tip glowing orange in the dim light. The smell of hot metal and rosin filled the air. With a hand that did not dare tremble, he touched the iron to the joint, feeding a microscopic amount of new solder onto the break. It was the operation performed on a scale of millimeters. He snapped the casing shut and pressed the power button. A small green LED lit up. He handed it to Sarah. "It needs to charge for 5 minutes. It should hold." Those 5 minutes were the longest of David's life. He stood rigid, his gaze fixed on Mia, his own breath shallow. He was no longer a fixer of objects. He was a man holding on to a thread of hope. When Sarah plugged it in, the charging symbol appeared on the tiny screen. After an eternity, she unplugged it, placed the mask over Mia's face and pressed the button. The compressor whirred to life, delivering the medicated mist. Mia's frantic breathing began to slow, the terrifying whistle easing into deep, ragged gulps of air. Color returned to her lips. She slumped against her mother, exhausted but safe. The relief in the room was a physical force. Sarah looked at David, her face streaked with tears, and without a word, she pulled him into a fierce, grateful embrace. David stood stiffly for a moment, then his shoulders relaxed, and he awkwardly patted her back. It was in that moment of profound relief that his worn wallet, dislodged from his pocket during the frantic work, fell to the floor. It splayed open. Jessica, helping a now calm Mia with a glass of water, bent to pick it up. Her eyes fell on the photograph tucked inside. She looked from the picture to David, her expression softening with a sudden deep understanding. "She's beautiful, David," she said quietly. "Your granddaughter?" David pulled away from Sarah's embrace. He looked at the photo of Lily, then at Mia, now breathing easily, saved by his own 2 hands. The dam inside him, fortified by years of solitary grief, finally broke. "That was my daughter," he whispered, the words torn from a deep and hidden place. "Lily," his voice cracked, "she's gone." And then, in the silent, respectful space of the kitchen, surrounded by the people who had become his unwitting family, David Reid began to speak. He told them of the accident, the rain-slicked road, the split-second distraction, the guilt that had hollowed him out, the career and home he'd let crumble as punishment. He showed them the wound he had carried for a decade, and in the showing, it began, for the first time, to truly heal. The silence that followed David's confession was not awkward or pitying, it was sacred. The community kitchen, once just a place for a hot meal, had become a confessional. No one spoke. They simply let the weight of his words settle. Brian looked down at his own hands, no longer seeing just tools, but the potential for both destruction and healing. Jessica wiped a tear from her cheek, her view of the grimy, broken man forever replaced by one of a grieving father. Carl was the first to move. He walked to the large coffee urn, filled 2 mugs, and brought one over to David, placing it on the workbench with a solid thud. No words were needed. The simple, practical act of offering coffee said everything. "I hear you. You are still one of us." The next morning, Carl led David out the kitchen's back door and across a narrow, weed-choked alley to an adjacent, smaller building. It was a disused garage owned by the church, filled with decades of forgotten clutter. broken pews, stacks of mildewed hymnals, and a thick layer of dust that glittered in the slanted morning light. "This," Carl said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, "is a waste of good space." He kicked a stack of water-damaged cardboard boxes. "And that," he gestured to David, "is a waste of a good man." He laid out his plan. The church would grant them use of the garage. They could clear it out, turn it into a real workshop. David could run it properly, take in more complex repairs, train people like Brian formally, maybe even generate a small income by charging a minimal fee for those who could afford it. A real job, a real purpose, a foundation, not just for David but for others like him. "It won't be charity," Carl grunted, anticipating David's resistance. "It'll be a business, a social enterprise they call it. You'd be the foreman. You'd earn your keep." "We all would." David stood in the center of the dusty chaos, the weak sun illuminating motes of dust, dancing around him like possibilities. He saw past the rubble. He saw workbenches along the walls, tool chests, proper lighting. He saw Brian teaching another kid how to change a tire. He saw a place where broken things weren't thrown away but were given a second life. He saw a legacy for Lily that wasn't defined by her death, but by the healing she had inspired in him. He gave a single, slow nod. Okay. The transformation of the garage became a community project. It was no longer just David's story, it was theirs. Brian organized the younger guys to haul out the trash. Jessica used her organizational skills to catalog donated tools. Even Mia helped, carefully washing old mason jars to be used for organizing screws and bolts. The energy was palpable, a collective antidote to the despair that so often haunted their lives. Weeks later, a local sign painter, a recovering alcoholic David had helped by fixing his van, donated his services. On the freshly painted door of the now clean garage, in elegant forest green lettering, appeared the new name, Lily's Workshop. The day the sign went up, David stood outside for a long time, just looking at it. He didn't see a business. He saw a memorial. He saw a future. He pulled the worn photo of his daughter from his wallet, the one he now carried openly. "We're going to do some good here, Lils," he whispered, his voice steady. "I promise." The rhythm of Lily's Workshop was a symphony of purposeful noise. The buzz of saws, the hum of sanders, the clink of tools, and the low murmur of instruction had replaced the silence of the forgotten garage. David, now clean-shaven and wearing sturdy work clothes, moved between stations, his eyes missing nothing. He was no longer a man haunted by ghosts, but a conductor of second chances. It was on a sweltering August afternoon that the crisis arrived. A large panel truck from Windy City Fresh Foods screeched to a halt right outside the workshop, its engine belching smoke. The driver, a man named Leo, stumbled out, his face slick with panic. "My reefer unit died," he yelled, rushing into the workshop. "I've got $15,000 worth of perishable pharmaceuticals in the back for the children's hospital. The main shop can't get a tech out here for 3 hours." A wave of tension swept through the workshop. This was different from a broken radio or a wheezing child. This was a high-stakes, commercial-grade disaster with a ticking clock. Leo led them to the back of the truck. The refrigeration unit was a complex beast of pipes, wires, and compressors. Brian let out a low whistle. "Whoa, that's way over our pay grade, Dave." David didn't flinch. He approached the unit, his demeanor shifting into that of the senior engineer he once was. "Get me my diagnostic kit and the industrial multimeter." For the next hour, David was a man possessed. He traced electrical pathways, checked pressure gauges, and listened to the faltering compressor with a mechanic's stethoscope. The other men formed a silent, anxious semicircle behind him. The future of Lily's Workshop, its hard-won reputation, hung in the balance. "It's the control module," David finally announced, wiping grease from his forehead. "It's fried. We don't have a replacement, and we can't get one in time." A collective groan went up. Leo looked like he was going to be sick. "But," David continued, his voice cutting through the despair, "we can bypass it. It's a risk, We'll have to manually override the safety protocols and hardwire the compressor to run continuously. It's a temporary fix, but it will keep the cargo cold until you can get to the hospital." It was a daring, almost reckless plan. Bypassing the computer brain of a modern refrigeration unit was like performing open-heart surgery with a welding torch. One wrong connection could cause an electrical fire or destroy the compressor entirely. Under David's terse, precise directions, the workshop became an emergency operating room. Brian handled the heavy wiring. Marcus fetched tools with frantic speed. David himself worked at the heart of the machine, his soldering iron moving with an artist's grace, creating a new makeshift nervous system for the dying unit. The final connection was a thick red cable. David looked at Leo. "This is it. It'll either work or it'll pop." Leo just nodded, his jaw clenched. David touched the cable to the terminal. There was a sharp spark, a groan of metal, and then the beautiful, thunderous roar of the compressor kicking to life. A wave of cold, blessed air poured from the truck's vents. A cheer erupted from the gathered men. Leo grabbed David in a bear hug. "You saved me. You saved the whole shipment." The story of the miracle repair spread faster than the one about the inhaler. This wasn't just about saving one child. It was about saving a mission. The local news, always hungry for a feel-good story, sent a reporter. The next day, a woman with a microphone and a cameraman stood in Lily's workshop. As she interviewed David, asking about his past, a long, black Lincoln Navigator silently pulled up outside. The workshop door opened. All activity ceased. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright Chicago sun, was Arthur Reid. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than all the tools in the room combined. His eyes, hard and CEO sharp, scanned the space before landing on his son, who was holding a torque wrench and covered in grease. The reporter, sensing a seismic shift in the story, fell silent. Arthur took a step forward, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried through the dead quiet of the workshop. "David," he said, "they told me you were dead." The silence in the workshop was absolute, broken only by the distant city sounds filtering through the open door. David stood frozen, the torque wrench feeling like 100 pounds in his hand. The cameraman, sensing a drama far beyond a simple community piece, kept his camera rolling. Arthur Reid's gaze was a physical weight. It swept over the greasy concrete floor, the second-hand tools, the men in their stained work clothes, and finally it settled back on his son. A decade of grief, anger, and bitter silence hung between them. "They told me you were dead," Arthur repeated, his voice cracking on the last word, the polished CEO veneer shattering to reveal the raw, grieving father beneath. "After the funeral, you just vanished. I hired investigators. They found nothing. I thought you'd done something final." David finally found his voice, but it was rough, stripped bare. "I did." He gestured around the workshop, a slow, sweeping motion that took in all of it, the grime, the order, the purpose. "The man I was died that day, too. This is what's left." Arthur took another step inside, his expensive leather shoes looking alien on the oil-stained floor. He ignored the reporter, the cameraman, everyone but his son. "I looked for you, David, for a year. Then I stopped. It was easier to mourn a ghost than to face the son who blamed me." This was a new wound, ripped open in front of everyone. David's composure faltered. "You blamed me first. You said I should have been more careful." "I was grieving." Arthur's shout echoed in the garage, a burst of long-suppressed pain. "I lost my granddaughter. I saw my son destroying himself with guilt, and I didn't know how to fix it. So I said the worst thing I could think of, and you used it as an excuse to disappear." He looked around, his eyes lingering on the sign on the door. Lily's workshop. "You built this? A mechanic's shop?" Brian, protective of the sanctuary they had built, stepped forward. "It's not a mechanic's shop. It's a workshop. David, he fixes things. He fixes people." Arthur's eyes snapped back to David, and for the first time the anger seemed to drain from him. replaced by a dawning, heartbreaking comprehension. He saw the men watching David not with pity, but with respect. He saw the order in the chaos, the purpose in the poverty. He saw the legacy his granddaughter's name was building in this unlikely place. "I offered you the world back," Arthur said, his voice now quiet, defeated. "The company, the penthouse, your old life. You never even replied." David looked down at the torque wrench in his hand, a simple, honest tool. "It wasn't my world anymore. This is." He met his father's eyes, his own clear for the first time. "I'm not the executive who failed his family. Here, I'm the man who saves a little girl's breathing. I'm the one who keeps a family's food from spoiling. This is who I am now." The confession hung in the air, a truth so simple it was devastating. Arthur Reid, the self-made millionaire, stood in a dusty garage and realized his son had built something he never could: redemption. The reporter slowly lowered her microphone. The story was no longer about a handyman. It was about this. Arthur's shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him. "I spent 10 years building a memorial wall around my heart," he whispered. "And you built a workshop." He took a final long look at his son, then turned and walked slowly back to his gleaming car, a lonely figure swallowed by the city he thought he owned. The Lincoln Navigator didn't pull away. It sat idling at the curb for a full 10 minutes, a dark, silent monolith of a different world. Inside the workshop, no one moved. The reporter and her cameraman had slipped away, recognizing that the real story had become private, too intimate to broadcast. David stood rooted to the spot, the confrontation with his father leaving him emotionally flayed open. Brian was the one who finally broke the tension. "You want me to go tell him to get lost, Dave?" David shook his head slowly. "No, it's okay." As if hearing him, the Navigator's driver door opened. Arthur Reid emerged again, but the corporate titan was gone. His shoulders were slumped, his tie was loosened, and he moved with the weary gravity of an old man. He walked back into the workshop, this time his eyes not judging the space, but truly seeing it. He stopped in front of a workbench where Mia's now famous pink radio sat, fully restored. He picked it up gently. "You fixed this?" Arthur asked, his voice rough. David nodded. "For a little girl. It plays her grandmother's song." Arthur ran a thumb over the plastic casing. "Your mother. She had a music box." He looked at David, his eyes glistening. "I could never get it to work after she died. I threw it out." The unspoken words hung between them. "I didn't have the patience. I didn't have the faith that broken things could be made whole again." Arthur set the radio down with immense care. He turned to face his son, his hands shoved into his expensive trouser pockets. "I was wrong," he said. The 3 words were simple, but they cost him dearly. "I was wrong to blame you. I was wrong to let you go. I was wrong about all of this." He gestured to the workshop. "I thought this was your surrender. I see now it's your victory." He took a deep breath. "The offer for you to come back to Reid Automotive, it still stands. But I'm not here to repeat it." David watched him, wary. "I'm here to make a new one," Arthur continued. "I want Reid Automotive to partner with Lily's workshop. Not a donation, a partnership. We'll fund your expansion. We'll send you our apprentices. You'll train them not just how to fix engines, but how to be men. And in return, you'll run our new community outreach division." The proposal landed in the quiet garage, more shocking than his earlier anger. Brian and the others stared, their mouths agape. David was speechless. It wasn't a rescue. It was a recognition. It was his father, after a decade, finally speaking his language. "You built something real here, David," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something I never could. Let me help you build it bigger. Let Lily's legacy save more than just radios and inhalers. Let it save companies from becoming as cold and broken as I was." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out not a business card, but a faded, creased photograph. It was of David, no older than 10, beaming with pride next to his father, both of them holding a model rocket they had built together. "I kept this," Arthur whispered. I missed my son, the one who loved to build things. David looked from the photograph in his father's hand to the workshop around him, to the men waiting for his answer. He saw the past and the future, not as opposing forces, but as two paths finally converging. He saw a destiny that wasn't about escaping who he was, but about integrating all of it, the loss, the pain, the skill, the redemption. He looked at his father and gave a single, slow nod. Okay, David said, let's talk. 6 months later, the transformation was breathtaking. The old garage was now the Reid Foundation, a gleaming, renovated space that smelled of fresh paint, new machinery, and ambition. The original grease-stained workbench stood proudly in the center, a monument to where it all began. But it was now surrounded by state-of-the-art equipment, computer diagnostic stations, and a small fleet of training vehicles, all donated by Reid Automotive. The partnership had been a front-page story. From ashes to autos, millionaire father and prodigal son reunite to rebuild lives. But inside the foundation, it wasn't about headlines, it was about work. Today was graduation day for the first official class. David stood at the front of the workshop, dressed in the same sturdy work clothes, but with a new confidence in his posture. Facing him were 15 graduates, men and women of all ages and backgrounds, who had spent 12 weeks in intensive training. Brian stood among them, now a lead instructor, his nervous energy channeled into a fierce pride. Carl, Jessica, Sarah, and Mia sat in the front row of folding chairs. Arthur Reid sat beside them, looking more comfortable in a simple polo shirt than he ever had in a suit. This isn't the end, David addressed the graduates, his voice strong and clear. It's your first tune-up. You came in here with engines that were sputtering. Life had thrown dirt in your carburetors, cracked your blocks. You leave here as certified mechanics, yes, but more than that, you leave as master troubleshooters. You've learned to listen to what's broken, to diagnose the root cause, and to have the patience to fix it. He called each name. As they walked up to receive their certificates, David didn't just hand them a piece of paper. He handed each one a specific tool. To a woman named Maria, who had struggled with self-doubt, he gave a precision torque wrench for knowing when to apply pressure and exactly how much. To a young man named Ben, who had a quick temper, he gave a set of feeler gauges for measuring the small spaces, for understanding that not every fix requires force. When Brian's name was called, David handed him a master diagnostic scanner, for seeing the whole system, not just the broken part. Brian's eyes shone with unshed tears as he took it. The final graduate was an older man named Walter, who had been unemployed for a decade. David handed him a simple, well-worn rubber mallet. This was the first tool I used here, David said, the workshop utterly silent. It's for when things are stuck, for gentle persuasion, for reminding us that not every problem needs a sledgehammer. Walter clutched the mallet like a holy relic. After the ceremony, as families celebrated and the graduates accepted job offers from waiting local garages, Arthur walked over to his son. You didn't just teach them to fix cars, David, he said, his voice filled with awe. You taught them how to reassemble their own lives. David looked out at the buzzing workshop, at Brian showing a graduate the new engine dyno, at Mia demonstrating a wiring diagram to a fascinated visitor. He saw the photo of Lily on the wall, her smile now presiding over a kingdom of hope. This was her gift, David said softly. Not the pain of losing her, but the purpose she left behind. This was the design I was always meant to build. He had not just reclaimed his life. He had reverse-engineered it, taken the blueprints of his own suffering and used them to construct a shelter for others. The master engineer had finally fixed his most complex machine, himself. The congressional invitation arrived precisely 18 months after the Foundation's first graduation ceremony. During that time, the Reid Foundation had evolved from a local Chicago story into a national phenomenon. Policy analysts in Washington, digging deeper than the heartwarming human interest pieces, had uncovered staggering metrics. 94% employment among graduates, near-zero recidivism rates, and most remarkably, a self-sustaining financial model that generated profit through community repair services. The Congressional Subcommittee on Economic Revitalization and Workforce Development summoned David Reid to explain how a simple workshop was solving problems that had confounded policymakers for decades. The night before his flight to Washington, David walked through the silent workshop alone. The familiar sense of motor oil and metal provided unexpected comfort. He moved slowly along what they called the wall of second chances, his calloused fingers gently tracing each artifact that documented their journey. Mia's pink radio, its plastic casing still bearing the faint marks of her small hands. Walter's rubber mallet, its handle smoothed by years of use. The salvaged circuit board from the refrigeration truck that had saved the pharmaceutical shipment. Each object represented more than a memory. It was a chapter in their story, a life transformed, living proof of their core belief that nothing is beyond redemption. Arthur, who had become the Foundation's strategic advisor, insisted on professional preparation. "David, we need speechwriters and media training," he urged. "Congressional hearings are political theater, and they'll eat an unprepared witness alive." But David remained firm. "They don't need another polished performance," he countered. "They need to hear what actually works. I'm going to speak our truth in our own words." The David Reid, who sat in the cavernous hearing room on Capitol Hill, represented a bridge between two worlds. He wore a simple but well-tailored navy suit, yet his hands resting on the polished mahogany table told a different story. They were a mechanic's hands, strong, capable, with permanent grease stains under his fingernails and a network of faint scars from countless encounters with sharp metal and hot solder. In his jacket pocket, he carried his two anchors, the faded photograph of Lily and Mia's burnt capacitor, now permanently sealed in clear plastic. When the chair called his name, David stood with unexpected calm. He felt the same focused tranquility that descended when diagnosing a complex engine failure. "Honorable members," he began, "my name is David Reid. I'm the founder of the Lily Reid Foundation, but first and foremost, I'm a diagnostician." He noticed politicians looking up from their papers, their expressions shifting from bureaucratic boredom to curiosity. "While you analyze economic indicators, I listen for the knock in the engine, feel for the vibration in the system. For years, I was one of those warning sounds society learned to ignore." He placed the plastic-encased capacitor on the table. Cameras zoomed in, projecting the tiny component throughout the room. "This failed part cost less than a penny," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. "When it failed, it silenced a song connecting a granddaughter to her late grandmother. Fixing it required no legislation or billion-dollar package, just knowledge and the belief that broken things deserve repair." He let the simplicity of the object contrast with the room's grandeur. "That little girl now wants to become a biomedical engineer because someone saw value where others saw trash." He explained their model in workshop terms, avoiding political jargon. "We don't run a charity, we run a workshop. Our students receive tools, not handouts. They learn that stripped threads can be re-tapped, seized engines freed, short circuits repaired. Most importantly, they learn that no breakdown is permanent. This mindset becomes their most valuable tool." Leaning forward, he delivered his challenge as the room fell completely silent. "The world's most advanced diagnostic equipment is worthless if nobody will lift the hood. My question is whether America still remembers how to get its hands dirty, whether we still believe in the dignity of repair." He looked at each committee member. "At my foundation, we're on the floor doing the work daily. Will you join us?" The silence stretched until the committee chair leaned into his microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Reid. That may be the most honest testimony we've heard in years." In that moment, David understood he hadn't just spoken to power. He had shown them where real power lives. The Foundation's wall of second chances stood as quiet testimony to their method. Each repaired object represented a life transformed through practical action rather than theoretical solutions. David's approach demonstrated that economic revitalization began not with sweeping policies, but with individual restoration. What made the Foundation's model so compelling to policymakers was its self-sustaining nature. Unlike traditional social programs that required constant funding, the workshop generated its own revenue while solving real community problems. This practical efficiency appealed across political divides, offering solutions that were both compassionate and fiscally responsible. David's testimony marked a turning point in how policymakers viewed workforce development. He presented a vision where government support meant empowering local initiatives rather than creating top-down solutions. The Foundation's success proved that the most effective change often came from the ground up, from people who understood their community's specific needs and challenges. 5 years after David's congressional testimony, the Reid Foundation had become a national institution with satellite locations in 7 major cities. What began as a single workshop in a Chicago garage had evolved into a movement that was reshaping how America approached workforce development and social rehabilitation. The Foundation's headquarters had expanded into the entire city block, but David had insisted on preserving the original garage. It stood as a living museum at the heart of the complex, its walls still bearing the original tool marks and the first iterations of the wall of second chances. New visitors would often find David there, explaining the significance of each artifact to wide-eyed students and visiting dignitaries alike. One crisp autumn morning, a special ceremony was taking place in the Foundation's main courtyard. Dozens of former students had returned, many now business owners, master technicians, or instructors themselves. Brian, once David's most skeptical student, now served as the Foundation's National Operations Director. He stood at the podium, addressing a crowd that included politicians, philanthropists, and most importantly, the current class of students. "We're not just here to celebrate numbers," Brian said, his voice strong and confident. "We're here to celebrate transformations. The Foundation has placed over 2,000 graduates in sustainable careers, but more importantly, it has restored 2,000 families, rebuilt 2,000 communities." The ceremony's highlight was the announcement of the Reid Innovation Grants. Funded entirely by the Foundation's business profits, these grants would provide seed money for graduates to start their own repair businesses in underserved communities. The first recipient was Maria Rodriguez, who had arrived at the Foundation 3 years earlier as a single mother on welfare. Today, she accepted the grant to open Maria's Automotive and Electronics in her former neighborhood. "What I learned here," Maria told the crowd, her voice thick with emotion, "was that being broken is temporary. This Foundation taught me that I contain my own repair manual. Now I get to teach that to others." David watched from the sidelines, Arthur standing proudly beside him. The old tension between father and son had long since melted away, replaced by a deep, mutual respect. Arthur had found his own redemption in the Foundation's work, using his business acumen to scale what David had started. "Your mother would be so proud," Arthur murmured, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "You built something that will outlive us all." Later that day, David walked through the advanced training facility where students learned everything from electric vehicle repair to robotics maintenance. He paused at a workstation where Mia, now a college engineering student, was teaching a group of new students how to troubleshoot solar panel systems. "It's all about reading the story," she was saying, echoing David's words from years earlier. "Every broken system is trying to tell you what's wrong. You just have to learn to listen." David felt a profound peace settle over him. The Foundation had taken on a life of its own, its values and methods carried forward by those he had taught. The workshop no longer depended on his daily presence. It had become self-perpetuating, each generation of graduates nurturing the next. That evening, as the celebration wound down, David returned to the original garage alone. He stood before Lily's photograph, now permanently displayed in a place of honor. The pain of her loss remained, but it had transformed into something new, not a wound, but a wellspring of purpose. "We did it, Lils," he whispered. "Your memory didn't just save one broken man, it's saving thousands." The Foundation's success had proven that the most powerful solutions were often the simplest. See value where others see waste. Invest in people others have written off, and never underestimate the power of a second chance. David Reid's legacy wasn't in the buildings or the numbers, but in the countless lives that had been mended in the workshop that bore his daughter's name. A decade after his congressional testimony, David received an email that made his heart stop for a moment. The subject line read, "Your story saved my son." The message was from a man in Dayton, Ohio, named Richard. His 24-year-old son, Kyle, had battled an opioid addiction for 6 years, going through periods of homelessness and despair. A month earlier, in a public library, Kyle had watched David's testimony on C-SPAN. Something about the simple, direct way David spoke about broken things and repair touched a place that moralistic lectures and family interventions had never reached. "He told me, Dad, if that man could fix himself, maybe I can too," Richard wrote. David kept the printed email on his desk, a humble reminder that the impact of his work went far beyond the statistics they tracked. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he waited. 6 months later, he visited the Foundation's newest branch in Cleveland. As he walked through the workshop, a lean young man, his arms covered in tattoos that couldn't completely hide old track marks, approached him. "Mr. Reid," the young man said, his voice slightly trembling, "I'm Kyle, the kid from Ohio." David looked at him, at the steady hands and the clear, sober eyes, and a wave of emotion so powerful hit him he could barely speak. Kyle told his story, how he had entered a rehab clinic the day after watching the video, how he had applied to the Foundation's program as soon as he was discharged, and how now, for the first time in a decade, he had a purpose and a salary. "You talked about diagnosing the root cause," Kyle said. "For me, the root cause was pain, the pain of not feeling worthy of being fixed. Your words, they gave me permission to try." That night, in the hotel, David couldn't sleep. The interaction with Kyle had triggered a new understanding. They meticulously kept data on their graduates, all 2,014 of them. But how many Kyles were out there? People touched indirectly by the story, the philosophy, the simple proof that redemption was possible. He proposed a new initiative, the Ripple Project. They created an online portal where people could share how the story of the Lily Reid Foundation had impacted their lives. In the first 6 months, over 5,000 stories came in. There was a teacher in New Mexico who used the video of David's testimony to teach resilience to his high school students. A former executive in Florida who, after being laid off and falling into depression, heard a David interview on the radio and decided to open a small furniture repair shop, finding a happiness her corporate career had never given her. A father in Oregon who repaired his relationship with his teenage son after working together to restore an old car. Inspired by the Foundation's ethos, they began mapping these indirect ripples on a digital map. The points of light spread across the entire country and then across the world. They estimated that their direct impact had touched about 10,000 lives, including graduates, their families, and immediate communities. But the indirect impact, those touched by the story, was estimated at over 50,000 people and still growing. David realized that the Foundation had become two things: a practical, efficient machine for social repair, and also a powerful modern myth, an urban fairy tale that proved that knights in shining armor weren't necessary. Sometimes, all you needed was a man with a set of wrenches and the stubborn refusal to accept that something, or someone, was beyond salvage. He returned to the original workshop, to the pink radio on the wall of second chances. That small repair, that first act of faith, had generated a ripple that was still spreading, touching lives in places he would never visit, healing wounds he would never see. The workshop was no longer just a physical place, it was an idea, and ideas, once set free, are impossible to contain. 15 years after the foundation became reality, its greatest symbol of success wasn't on a results chart or a trophy, but in the person of Dr. Mia Patterson, 24 years old, walking into the Reid Foundation boardroom as its new Director of Innovation. The girl with the pink radio and the broken inhaler had graduated with honors in biomedical engineering from MIT. The circle was about to close in a way not even David in his boldest dreams could have imagined. Mia's first meeting with the senior leadership, which included David, Arthur, Brian and Carl, now retired but always present, was emotional. She didn't arrive with a PowerPoint full of corporate jargon. She arrived with a prototype. "Remember my inhaler," she began, placing a modern device, clearly inspired by the old one, on the table. "I learned from David that fixing is good, but preventing is better, and designing things not to break is best of all." She then described the Lily Labs project, her new initiative within the foundation. The goal wasn't just to fix what was broken, but to innovate so that critical things, like medical devices for underserved communities, would be more durable, affordable, and easier to repair. Her prototype was a low-cost inhaler with 3D printed modular parts and a simplified circuit that any foundation technician could fix with basic training. "We're applying the same principles David taught me right here in this workshop when I was 9 years old," she explained, her gaze sweeping the faces around her. "Diagnose the real problem, which is the prohibitive cost and planned obsolescence of these devices. Use available resources creatively, 3D printers, open-source circuits. And the most important part, never accept that something can't be fixed or improved just because that's how it's always been done." David watched, a knot of pride and emotion tightening his throat. This was no longer the little girl who looked at him with admiration. She was a confident woman, a leader, applying the central philosophy of his life on a scale he had never conceived. She was taking repair to a systemic level, attacking the design flaws that perpetuated social injustice. The Lily Labs pilot project was launched in 3 underserved Chicago communities. Besides the inhaler, Mia's team developed a low-cost glucose monitor and a portable, solar-powered nebulizer. Each device came with a clear repair manual and the promise that the Reid Foundation would train community members to perform maintenance, creating local microeconomies around health. The success was resounding. A Time magazine cover story titled "The Radio Girl Who is Fixing American Healthcare" solidified Mia and the foundation as a transformative force. Donations and partnerships with universities and tech companies poured in, but Mia, learning from David, maintained control. Lily Labs would remain rooted in the foundation, its mission driven by need, not profit. On a quiet Saturday, David found Mia in the original workshop, fixing a broken Lily Labs 3D printer. She was focused, her hands moving with the same quiet dexterity his had demonstrated so many times. "Need a hand?" he asked, smiling. "I'll always need your hand, David," she replied, smiling back. "You showed me that the most important tools aren't these." She pointed to the wrenches and soldering irons. "They're patience, curiosity, and the faith that a solution exists." In that moment, David understood the completeness. The seed he had planted by fixing a plastic radio had not only grown, but blossomed into a tree that was now bearing its own fruit, nourishing others. The girl whose life he had saved was now saving countless others, using the very lessons he had imparted. The foundation had organically evolved from a sanctuary for fixing broken things into a nursery for compassionate innovation. Lily's legacy was no longer just about the past. It was a living organism, breathing, growing and adapting, ensuring that the act of repair never ended, only transformed. 20 years. The number felt both monumental and insignificant as David Reid stood in the exact spot where it all began. The original workshop was preserved as a living museum, nestled like a sacred heart within the now sprawling Lily Reid Foundation campus that covered an entire city block. At 67, his hair was fully silver, his face a roadmap of laugh lines earned through years of quiet satisfaction. The foundation was a global entity now, with locations from London to Tokyo, its model studied in business schools and its story told in documentaries. Yet on this crisp autumn morning, David had slipped away from a meeting with international donors. He needed the silence of this first workshop, the scent of old wood and oil that no amount of renovation could erase. He ran a hand over the original workbench, its surface a testament to countless repairs, its nicks and stains more precious to him than any polished award. The wall of second chances stood before him, a timeline of transformation. Mia's pink radio, Walter's mallet, the capacitor sealed in plastic. His eyes moved to newer additions, a prototype of the Lilly Labs inhaler, a photo of Kyle, now a manager at the Cleveland branch, standing with his proud father. And finally, his gaze settled on the centerpiece, the smiling school photo of his daughter, Lily. The pain of her loss was no longer a sharp sting, but a deep, resonant ache, like a familiar chord that had become part of his life's music. He had not replaced that loss, but had built a magnificent structure around it, a monument to love that now sheltered thousands. The door creaked open, a sound he knew as well as his own heartbeat. Arthur stepped inside, moving slower now, but with a peace that had eluded him for most of his life. He no longer wore suits, but comfortable sweaters, often stained with paint from the art classes he'd started teaching at the Foundation's community center. "They're looking for you, you know," Arthur said, his voice warm. "The delegation from Berlin wants to meet the legendary David Reid." "Let them wait a few minutes," David replied, not turning around. "This is where the legend actually lives. In this bench, in these walls." Arthur came to stand beside him, looking at Lily's photo. She would be so amazed by all this. He gestured vaguely, encompassing the entire foundation. David shook his head slowly. "No, I think she'd just be glad her dad stopped being sad." The simple truth of the statement hung between them. The billions of dollars in economic impact, the international accolades, the policies changed. It all distilled down to that one, human truth. Later that day, David walked through the Advanced Innovation Wing, the Lilly Labs. The hum here was different. 3D printers, laser cutters, the quiet murmur of engineers and designers. He saw Mia, now a confident leader with a team of her own, explaining a new modular wheelchair design to a group of visitors. She caught his eye and gave him a small, knowing smile before continuing her explanation. She didn't need his guidance anymore, and that was the greatest success he could have ever imagined. As evening fell, David returned once more to the original workshop. He sat on the old stool, the one Carl had found for him decades ago, and simply listened. In the silence, he could almost hear the echoes, the first sputter of the repaired radio, playing a grandmother's song, the frantic tapping of keyboard keys as he diagnosed the refrigeration truck's failure, the shaky breath of a child whose inhaler had just whirred back to life, the triumphant cheer when the first graduate received their diploma. The foundation was a living, breathing entity now, its heartbeat the steady rhythm of repair and renewal. It would go on without him, as it should. New challenges would arise, new broken things would need fixing, new generations would discover the power of restoration. David took one last look at Lily's photograph, at the smile that had launched 1,000 second chances. "We did good, baby girl," he whispered into the quiet workshop. "We did real good." He turned off the light, closed the door, and walked out into the twilight, the echo of a million repaired dreams following him into the night.